You think we are crazy. Reviews are not for the sane. Look at us, unloved, hunted. Let's talk about Andor Season 2.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the I Have the Stone podcast. So, Daniel, can you let the people know what we're going to be discussing or debating today?
So this week we are talking about Season 2 of Star Wars Andor, which picks up from Season 1 as Cassian Andor has joined the rebellion against the Galactic Empire, which is organizing to take the fight to that empire as it tightens its grip on the galaxy. So what did we think of Season 2 of Andor?
I thought this was another great season, and this is, for me, some of the best Star Wars, just because it feels a lot more grown up, a lot more mature in its content and what it's doing, and its characters as well. How it tackles the complexity of the rebellion. For a lot of stories, you have the good guys and the bad guys, and the bad guys do bad things, and the good guys do good things, but in Andor and in Rogue One as well, but in Andor specifically, as we're talking about here, is that you have people that are trying to do good and trying to sort of build a better future, but in doing so, they have to make ugly decisions, and it's just great in terms of that complexity and the richness of characters. I just feel like this show does it really, really well. And then on top of that, sort of the narrative and plots and the storylines that's going on here, with sort of everything that's happening on Gorma, etc. I just thought this hit the ball out of the park for me, anyways. And it did start slow for me. First couple of episodes, I was a little bit concerned that it wasn't going to recapture the magic of season 1 of Andor, and it was kind of heading in a direction where I felt like maybe they were a little bit lost and they didn't know how to tackle season 2. But, when we were discussing this, I initially said from episode 6, but actually having rewatched it, because again, I wasn't super invested in the early episodes, but having rewatched it for this review, I kind of went back to like 4, 5, 6 to kind of see how it was building out to, the latter half of the season. And even there, you can kind of feel the pieces sort of starting to fall into place. You can feel, characters moving. You can feel pieces being put in place for sort of what comes later in the season. And it's just really, really well crafted, in my opinion. And I'm quite sad that we don't get another season for obvious reasons, what happens with Rogue One. But I completely love this. And Andor as a whole, it's just been 2 great seasons.
I actually ended up watching season 1 and season 2 in the past couple of days. It was freaking hard.
It's quite the ride.
Yeah. I just finished watching, the end of season 2 today. So overall, I would say season 2 was good. Don't get me wrong. I just think season 1 set such a high bar. I felt like season 2 found it hard to maintain that high bar because I do feel like it wasn't as engaging as season 1. Season 1, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't say immersed, but I was just like, while I was watching, I was like, damn, I did not expect Star Wars to be this good, because I was expecting like the basic Star Wars. You know what I'm saying? You know what you're going to get from a Star Wars story. I was expecting to see the lightsabers and all of that. But this one didn't feel like that. This one felt like they were exploring themes, personal sacrifices, obviously, the rebellion and just the resistance and all of that. So I was thinking, damn, like, this one felt deeper than I thought it was going to be. Now, I wouldn't say it was like, it had profound moments or moments that are, caption worthy. But I would say I'm kind of like referring to season 1. In terms of season 2, sorry. So I kind of drifted off to season 1. That's what I felt about for season 1. Season 2, it was still good. I think there was like a lot of action in this one, and it makes sense because it's kind of like the outcome of season 1, because season 1 was the build up to the rebellion, obviously, and build up to certain character arcs. So season 2 kind of made sense for the path that they went to, and it was engaging many times. However, I feel like there was certain episodes where I was a bit drifted off and drifting away. I felt like there's moments that kind of lasted a bit too longer than it should, which obviously we'll speak about. But overall, I think I had a good time with season 2. I had a good time with season 2, but it definitely wasn't better than season 1. But season 2, I had a good time. Obviously, had, like I said, some issues.
And also, notably, you've not watched Rogue One yet, right? So you don't know what happens to Cassian. This pretty much ends with set up for Rogue One in a bunch of ways. And that is not a frame of reference you've got.
Yeah. That's why I was so surprised when I watched the Rogue One trailer today. I was like, oh, crap. Because I was just so confused about the whole Star Wars timeline. I was asking, obviously, you, Daniel, today, like, okay, so where the hell is this in the whole timeline? Like, what's the order? And then, obviously, when he was telling me, I was like, what the flips? I was surprised that this was before episode 4. I was like, yeah, so like the whole timeline is getting me so confused. So I'm going to do a lot of background research into what, before watching Rogue One, just so, everything can make more sense.
So for me, I really liked Andor season 1. I've always wanted a Star Wars show that is not focused on the big epic battles and the big, destiny and heroes' journeys and stuff like that, but rather is focused kind of on the ground level. I've always found the Han Solos, the Landos, the Jabbas, I've always found the ground level and the kind of the seedy underbelly of the Star Wars universe more interesting than almost kind of the main story. And so Andor season 1 was a real breath of fresh air. So I was really anticipating this, and you can go back like a year and a half where every time we mention Star Wars, I say, well, it's all crap, but at least season two of Andor will be great. And then I watched this, and I just did not care. I just could not get into it. I don't think it's all bad. It's more like I really dislike the style of storytelling, which is written for the moment and for specific lines as opposed to bigger story arcs. Hervé, if you've seen it twice, maybe you can fill me in on some things. But just as I was watching it, I had no idea what was important and what wasn't. And even reading what people have been saying about it, I do not recognize the same show. We must have been watching different shows. I do think there's some interesting stuff in here. I think the last 2.5 episodes are pretty good. And I think that should have been the main story. I think the different parts of the story are pretty unconnected. At least nowhere near as much as, there are connections, obviously, but they're nowhere near as connected as they should be. I'm having a really hard time finding a character arc or a story for Cassian. I do not know what his deal is in this show. There are hints of it and bits and pieces of it, but it does not seem to come together. There's a whole bunch of characters who have actual journeys in this, but Cassian does not seem to be one of them. And that made it really hard for me to kind of really get excited about this and really get into it and really put in the effort to piece together all the different clues and components of it, because I kept waiting for the plot to start. I don't want to overstate how much I dislike this, because there are quite a few things in here that I did like, but overall I did not find it held together very, very much. People seem to lose their minds over things that I find pretty underwhelming. Either I'm crazy or they're crazy, and I'm willing to have that fight in the next 45 minutes. It's not what I expected it to be. It's not what I wanted it to be. And I kind of left with a big shrug at the end. Let's talk about it.
Finally, Daniel and Hervé are opposing ends. I've been waiting for so long for this moment, because I'm usually the one that's getting beaten up by both of you.
And what's interesting about this, Hervé, you and I have fairly similar tastes in terms of story, what goes into a good story.
Yeah.
And for us to have such different reactions to the same story,
it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. It's actually interesting what you say about Andor and Cassian in this, about him not having a story arc or plot in the or something kind of an overarching story to his character. And it's really weird because I don't disagree with that, but how I viewed Andor as a whole, I didn't read, I know he's the central character and it's named after him, etc. But I kind of viewed it as the wider scope of characters that was going on, and the wider story that they were telling about how they were forming the rebellion, and how all the characters had some type of not influence over each other, but how it was all connected, from people like Mon Mothma in what she's doing in the Senate, and kind of speaking about the atrocities and stuff like that, and trying to, bring to light essentially what the Empire is doing. And then you've got Luthen and his assistant and stuff like that, and how they're just kind of working in the show. Basically, I kind of saw it as more an ensemble, if you would say, as opposed to Andor being the main focus. So yeah, I kind of do agree that there wasn't, a complete journey that he went on. And there were small moments in there where he's having to he's questioning some of the choices that are having to be made. And he's questioning almost his commitment to the rebellion. And I can't remember, I think there was a moment where he's talking with Bix about potentially leaving and running away and being together. And her kind of reaffirming that he needed to be on this journey. So yeah, I don't disagree too much on what you said on that side of things, but I just thought how they built the whole stuff that was going on Gorma, and how the Empire was almost manipulating and provoking. And what I found interesting about that was how both sides kind of wanted the same thing to happen, but for different reasons, and they were kind of feeding into each other. And it was this whole, not cat and mouse game, essentially, but just you don't know the whole deal of it, and you're just kind of watching it unfold, and you're kind of watching how things are playing out. And I thought it was quite interesting to see it from, what's the character's name? The one I was dating, Adria.
That's Sarah.
Civil. Yeah, and just like how you kind of see it from his perspective in terms of like he feels like he's just kind of going in there to like apply some like order and this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, there's this whole other like scheme and this other plan that he's not aware of in there. And I felt like his actual character journey as well from season 1 to season 2 was very interesting as well. But I kind of pass back over to you in terms of what you kind of didn't like and what didn't work for you in the story.
So on paper, I like quite a few of the pieces, right? First of all, I agree that this is the story of the rebellion, not so much of Cassian, but Cassian kind of should kind of hold it together. I've been defending him from day one, right? I liked him in Rogue One as a contrast to the kind of the young idealistic rebel. Like he's the old grizzled rebel who lost all of his humanity and passion and is just consumed by the mission, right? That's who he is in Rogue One, right? When Andor season 1 was announced, people would say, why is the least interesting supporting character in Rogue One getting a spin-off series? It's like, well, just we've not had a rebel, like a story about the rebellion before. We know very little about this guy. Let's see what other stories they can come up with. And that paid off in season 1. So I've been defending Andor as a character, like from the beginning. But as far as the Gorman story goes, I like a lot of the pieces. I like this idea that the rebellion is trying to grow up and is trying to get organized, and there are all these splinter groups. What's that character's name? The extremist.
Is it Saw?
Yeah. We had Saw Gerrera's faction in the first season, who is the militant extremist who is willing to break all the eggs in the galaxy, right, to make this omelet. And then the Gorman resistance is kind of like a mirror image of that, where they are very passionate and very inexperienced. And that makes them just as dangerous because they're going to make mistakes. And you've got kind of the establishment rebellion, if you want to call it that, in the center, who are trying to wrangle all these different groups and are trying to get the job done as they see it, right? So that's the Mon Mothma faction. And I like the idea of Cyril kind of going to, like, essentially the colonial officer going to this indigenous culture, right? And imposing imperial values and knowledge and ways on them for their own benefit, right? He believes he's making them better by making them more like him, right? That's kind of an interesting idea. And then the idea that Cassian is sent there to kind of teach Gorman rebels how to do a rebellion because they're just screwing things up and they just won't listen. One of my favorite moments in that sequence was where he makes contact with his Gorman contact and he basically points out to him all the ways in which he could be an Imperial spy, and they didn't check for it. Just laying out, like, these are all the ways you could be that now, right? And you're lucky that I am who you want me to be, but I could have been somebody else, right? And, like, there's good stuff in here, right? It just, we spent, like, 4 episodes on Gorm, and I think what I'm missing is, like, this season is kind of in the middle between one big story and episodic, where it's like maybe 3 or 4 smaller stories that have a loose connection. And I think that is kind of what made it difficult for me to care, because we would spend so much time on each individual piece, which then would kind of just end. And there would be some connection to the next piece, but not a very strong one. So the stuff that happens on the farming planet in the beginning has very little to do with, what happens towards the end, right? Like, I think that just made it difficult.
What they were kind of going for was, I think there was like a time jump between each arc, wasn't there? It's like a year or 2 between each arc, which again does make it difficult to really have that proper connective tissue between each of the arcs, just because there is so much time in between. And there are ways to do it, and there are ways to sort of make it gel a little bit better. But I do agree with you on that. Is that it just, especially the first 3 episodes, like I feel like you could have completely cut those out and done something completely different.
For me, the story begins in episode 10, because when they discover the plans for the Death Star, and they've realized that they're running out of time and they have to get their act together now or it's too late. That is the real story. That's the part that I cared about. But that took up like 2.5 episodes.
You didn't care about Luthen trying to set up Gorm for failure, essentially, to spark a wider rebellion because of how important Gorm was and because of how rich Gorm was as a city and culture and this, that, and the other, and how a city like that, if they were seen to be heavily oppressed by the Imperials, how if they were seen to be, kind of using Gorm as a setup to spark a wider rebellion across the galaxy. Did you not find that element of it interesting at all?
So that's the part where I'm not sure we watched the same show, because they were not that oppressed. What was happening was that they had an Imperial presence, and they were tightening the control. And what the Gormans didn't know was the whole thing about how the planet will be turned into a mine, and how their entire civilization and culture will be wiped out because the Empire needs their resources, right? But we did not really see the Gormans being all that oppressed. Like, yes, there were stormtroopers walking
But it was
around,
more-
and yes, there was like an imperial governor
Yeah.
and whatever, but we did not see very much happening, and we also did not follow any Gorman characters that were struggling with being occupied.
Okay, so they implied about the massacre that happened previously, and they kind of like hinted at it, and sort of the whole Imperial building the armory in front of sort of kind of shadowing the monument or the sort of the memorial piece that they had for the previous massacre, and that was like a little bit of a hint as to the Imperial just kind of doing what they want, and on their side using it as a way to provoke the Gormans to sort of again gain a tighter grip on the planet. But I feel like Luthen's plan wasn't to show that they were sort of heavily sort of oppressed, was more to show that, okay, this important piece that's come into play, like, Gorm's such like an important city and an important planet to the rest of the galaxy for them to have their eyes on. And again, we had like the broadcasters that were kind of like reporting on a daily basis what was going on Gorm. As soon as he saw that there was potential there for them to finally join the rebellion, it was the idea of what if they're shown to, push too much on the Imperial, and then you had the whole Gorm massacre that happened in episode 8, and it's just a case of what if they're shown to, push too hard, the Imperial react with an iron fist and completely do what they did in episode 8, and then that's then broadcast to the rest of the galaxy. That's then almost showing like, look what happened to Gorm. What do you think is going to happen when the Imperial or the Empire come to where you are, essentially? And this is why we need to fight back. And this is showing the Empire for its true colors. Because again, like a lot of people were blinded by the Imperial in this. It's like Cyril. I feel like Cyril's like the perfect embodiment of it in terms of he was actually within the organization. He was working within it, and he thought that he was one of the good guys. He thought that he was doing good across the Empire. And then when he actually realized the truth and like, no, we're actually the bad guys, you kind of see the character switch in his final moment. So that's kind of where I was like heavily invested. And then again, you have the dilemma within Cassian is that he understands that these people are really well under equipped to deal with the Empire. It's hard to not say Empire because Imperial Empire or whatever. He kind of saw that they were very, very under-equipped to deal with it. And then kind of slowly realizing, no, this is what Luthen wanted, essentially, was to set them up for failure. I thought all that kind of like storyline was great. And then again, when you like flip it on the other side and you've got the Imperial, and then you're kind of like figuring out, why the planet is so important to them and why it's so important for them to kind of like mine on this planet. For one, they had control over the narrative, what was quite interesting is that you had the initial report that they kept kind of showing that was broadcasting as things were building up. And then after the Gorm massacre, it switched to a second reporter who had a different narrative and a different story. And then obviously you saw the scenes that happened in the Senate with people kind of blaming the Gorm people for what happened essentially. So they had like the narrative kind of under control, and they were kind of like using it as okay, these people are dangerous and we've had to come and impose our will on this planet. So I don't know. I thought it was just fascinating on both sides of the coin.
Yeah, as a concept, yes. As a story, not so much. And I think that is kind of the part where I had trouble really getting into it, is because it's not like none of the parts that you mentioned are actually wrong. Like I think that's a fine story. It's just I had a hard time caring about it because we did not really have this embodied by characters like we do have Cyril, right? But outside of that, it's pretty abstract, and it's like a 30,000 foot view of the idea, right? We're not going into the Gorman resistance. Like, we do see them, but they're kind of nameless, faceless background characters who don't have very much in the way of personality or stories or struggles. We don't really see them argue with each other over, like they do argue over, should we go now, should we go later, stuff like this. But we're not really seeing like different people reacting to the occupation. And that is just something I guess I was missing. And that made it harder for me to get really invested, especially since we spent so much time on it. I do have like a favorite moment in the Gorman story, and that is as the kind of the riot is building up. They are chanting these very kind of boilerplate protest slogans, and then one of these guys starts singing this folk song, this Gorman folk song that has been established like an episode earlier. He just stubbornly starts singing it. And then people around him realize what he's doing and they join in. And before you know it, the entire crowd is singing this song in defiance because it's an assertion of Gorman identity, right? It's an open rejection of imperial control, right? Because the Empire wants wants to make everybody like them, right? That was a really cool moment. But the entire riot sequence did not have to be 25 minutes. It's kind of like a microcosm of my issue, where it's a really cool idea, and this moment is great, and that will make for a great TikTok short or whatever it is. But the entire thing is like a 25-minute sequence that is mostly repetition, and you can cut that down by more than half, and it will keep the same thing.
Fair. And you didn't like the whole interactions between Cyril and Deirdre in terms of like, this is someone that he's been in love with the whole time, and then this is a woman that is, just kind of obsessed with proving herself and glory and like, achieving certain status, etc. And then that betrayal moment between the two of them, and you didn't like that. I don't know if he was like invested in some of their story at all, enough for that to impact or to him.
Yeah, to cut to the chase, I think this movie, like this entire series, is written for the moment and not for the overall story. I can appreciate what they were doing with these two characters, and certainly the moment of betrayal, right, where Cyril realizes that Deidre has been using him and stuff like that. That's fine, right? That's a good moment. I'm not taking issue with that specific moment itself, right? I think that was actually one of the stronger points. But just overall, they were always writing for the moment and specific lines and specific like shots and stuff like this. And it did not feel like some scenes are under 20 seconds long. And there are some things where a character just needs to deliver a line, and the entire thing from start to end of the scene is under 30 seconds. Because all we need to do is this one line. We don't need to set it up. We don't need to have back and forth between two different characters. We don't need, we don't need to build it up. And, just a minute ago, I complained about a sequence being way too long, and now I'm complaining about them being way too short. But that is kind of part of it, where they just had specific moments in mind, I think, and not the overall story. And I think that is really what it all comes down to.
I was invested in some of the stories. Like I was invested in, like, especially with the outcome between Bix and kind of like getting her back her revenge on the Doctor who pretty much tormented her, which was, I think that was pretty rushed. There were other stories.
It was a scene, right? She kind of goes to him, shoots him.
She put the thing back on his head. And
that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she puts the torture device on him, locks the door, walks away, and implication being he will die. Yeah.
Yeah, that one felt a bit random because it was like I wanted to kind of like see a build up to that. It could have even been like a little planning or just something which was a build up to that, because I was like her storyline between them two was like something which I found very like interesting. Andor's well character, his character was a bit iffy. I think obviously in season 1 it made sense for him for his character to be like the highlight standout one, because it's like he's someone that doesn't want to be a leader, but he's put in situations where he's forced to be a leader. So obviously you're gonna see like his story in season 1 is gonna shine. But in this one it felt very, I don't know, but it's not that he didn't feel like, I don't know how to say it, but like you just saw him here and there, if that makes sense. So it didn't feel like his story was a story, if that made sense. It was like you'll see him where he would need to be in a scene for something to make sense. And now I'm kind of starting to understand because of Rogue One. However, what I will say is I don't necessarily agree with episodes not needing to be there. I do understand you guys' points. However, I think, especially like with the first 3 episodes, I think those were necessary in terms of the overall point of the story of the film, which was just, an add-on to Imperial oppression. Sorry. So I think that was the reason why those episodes were there, like especially with the like whole film of surveillance as well. So those scenes specifically show that you listen, no matter where you go, the Imperial will be there and they will be tormenting you. So I think it was necessary for that. Pacing was another issue as well. I do agree. There's like, especially with the rebellion attack, that was a bit long, and there were certain scenes, even like at the end when Andor's, where Bix had Andor's child, I was thinking, God damn, that scene is longer than it needs to be. I just think overall, I think that there was purpose behind certain episodes. For me, it just wasn't as engaging as compelling as season 1. I think season 2 should have been more compelling, because now the rebellion's pretty much being formed. You can see the hierarchy, you can see, the powers at play. So I think this should have been the season where, especially with Andor, he shines. But unfortunately, I think that's one of my biggest issues with Andor's character. Just felt like he was there. I think overall, I had a good time seeing imperial oppression and kind of like, you know, how that was where I got my enjoyment from. However, my issue was, you know, I think they were more character focused rather than story as a whole. Because there's only, like I said, I picked out certain bits that I liked and themes that I liked. However, the story as a whole, I don't think it was as engaging.
So I think what this should have been is 12 episodes. Each one is a different story about a different aspect of the rebellion that shows us how the Empire works and how the rebellion resists against it on a different planet. Maybe the last 2 episodes with all the pieces together where the rebellion learns about the Death Star being built. And then the last 2 episodes are about, okay, what does the rebellion do in response to that? I think that would have been much, much stronger. And then you could have done the episode on the farming planet. You could have done the Gorman resistance. You could have done a few other examples. You could have focused on different characters. Overall, that kind of adds up to a picture of what position the rebellion is in, and I like how the Death Star, like what that really means for the rebellion, for the people of the galaxy, for the Empire, and so on. And I think that would have just been a stronger structure. This obsession with making it an 8-hour-long movie, but that's really 5 different movies. That is where a whole bunch of different stories are kind of chopped up and kind of sprinkled throughout these episodes. And this is not just this show. Like, this is pretty much every show like this that does it like this. And I'm just very tired of it. And I don't think it's a good form of storytelling. Like you have to do it really well for it to really be worthwhile. And I don't think it worked out in this case.
In terms of episode 10 onwards, which you actually said you did like, why did that stand out a little bit more to you compared to the rest of the season?
Because now we had a plot and stakes and consequences. That's why. And because it tied back to the larger Star Wars story. And there were like a few different pieces to it. One of them is like I've said, it creates urgency for the rebellion, right? One of the ideas that crops up throughout the season is, especially Mon Mothma advanced this idea, is that you need to bide your time and you need to do it right. You don't get second chances, so you have to get it right on the first try. And that means we have to be deliberate and cautious. And like there's this very ill-conceived flashback where Luthen and his adoptive daughter kind of do some rebelling, right? And she's like very impatient and just wants to push forward. And he says, we wait and we wait and we lose and then we win. He said something to that effect, which essentially means you don't take risks, you take your time, you plan, you get it right. And the existence of the Death Star means they're out of time. They have to move, and if they're not ready, they're not ready. And that is a cool idea. And then in addition to that, we have like this one Imperial guy who was an informant for the rebellion, who is completely traumatized. Like he's the one who hacks Deidre's files and gets access to them and learns about the Death Star project and leaks that to the rebellion. And when he meets with Luthen in the park, he's completely shaken, right? He did not believe the Empire would do this. I think the Imperial perspectives are way overrated in this, but that was one where I said, okay, this is somebody who, even though he was sympathizing and working with the rebellion, on some level he still believed that the Empire was kind of what it said it was, and the existence of the Death Star changes the rules. And that was cool. In my opinion, what the entire season should have been, they find out about the Death Star, they have to extract Mon Mothma and other rebels from Coruscant, and they have to move the pieces into position and get all the different factions under control, because now the clock is ticking and now they have a target. And if that had been the entire plot of the season, more focused on that idea, I think that would have been stronger. And you could have sprinkled in ideas like Gorm and other ideas into that plot, I think. Just as I was watching the last 2.5 episodes, I kept thinking, yeah, this is kind of interesting. Like, we're actually seeing the Empire do stuff, and we see the rebels doing stuff. And it's kind of cool. And we're kind of seeing like actual stakes and actual tension. It's not like there's none of that in the early episodes, but not nearly enough. We've talked a little bit about just the basic plot of it. I think we just have different tastes when it comes to this. I kept wanting them to get to the point, and they just didn't nearly enough. Another aspect I wanted to bring up is that this gets lauded as the smart, gritty one, the one that speaks truth to power, the one that like understands fascism and authoritarianism and oppression. And I wish some of the writers had cracked a book before they wrote this, because there's nothing in this. Like the way the Empire operates, it was written by people who have never read a history book.
Why'd you say that? I'm not a historian on this type of stuff as well, so why'd you say that?
So like the history of fascism and authoritarianism, it's not like I'm an expert, but it's a hobby, right? And I try to understand this stuff because I consider it like the failure state of societies, right? This is what happens when societies break. And understanding how it happens and how it can get its grip on people and how that is contrasted with how destructive it is really interesting to me. Part of this is like this is what happened to my great grandparents, right? So I want to understand what happened, but I also want to understand how it happened in other places and times, right? And I noticed two lines that indicated that somebody had heard about this topic before. The first one was, "If only the emperor knew." That's a Russian saying. And that is basically this idea that in authoritarianism, the leader is kind of insulated from their policies. Like in Russia, people would say, if only the Tsar knew what the government is doing, if only Stalin knew, if only Putin knew. There's this idea that the brutality of the state is separate from the personality of the leader. And you can worship the leader while the boot is on your neck. And that is an idea that is in this. And it's mentioned in one line. The second one was, you didn't mind the promotion. Because this is a lot how, I forget who says it to whom, but essentially, the idea was, yes, you hate the empire, but you didn't mind when they gave you promotions for being loyal.
What's her name? Said it to her boyfriend.
The guy that said it to Cyril?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the idea that people are made complicit in these kinds of systems by rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent. And that maps to real-world authoritarianism. Outside of that, there is not much. Like just how the empire behaves, how it exerts control, how it controls people. I did not recognize very much. It just drives me crazy when people are I saw some clips of Andor, like especially like the Saw Gerrera speech and stuff like that, or the Mon Mothma speech, which I thought was the worst thing in the series, her speech she gives in the Senate, because it's just empty platitudes that don't correlate to what's actually happening in the story and what she is trying to say and what would actually have an impact on people hearing it.
But
people go crazy about how deep and how smart these lines and speeches are, and it's like, I don't see it. Like, I'm not impressed by what this is saying about why fascism works and why it appeals to people and how it controls people and how its power structures work. And a show like this wants to do this.
Yeah, I don't think I got anything quite profound in some of the speeches. The only one that I really stuck with me was Luthen's in season 1 when he talks about the rebellion and why he's fighting and about like a future that he'll never see and stuff like that. I thought that was one where they absolutely nailed the speech. I actually rewatched that on YouTube a couple of weeks ago actually. But to kind of go back to some of the Imperial and some of the ways that it links to sort of kind of like fascism. I'm not well read on fascism. I'm not kind of well read on the failed states, etc. But can you not link it to modern day government and modern day issues? And again, I know you didn't like the Gorm storyline, or you like the idea of it, but didn't like the way it was executed. But in terms of how they manipulated the narrative on that sense, and how they manipulated the perspective of what was going on there, because again, the city had, or the planet had, what the Imperial wanted, and to get what they wanted, they had to create this narrative. They had to create this scenario where the Gorn people were fighting back, and the Gorn people were a threat to society and a threat to the Imperial, so that they can then kind of step in and take over control of their resources, because that was their ultimate goal. And you can kind of map that to how things are in the real world, and how you've seen states act whenever there's been, and it's not just like modern day. It's historical when you've got someone has something that you want, and you have to kind of find a way. And sometimes it's just by brute force, and it's just by violence. But in a day and age where you kind of have people that might protest your actions, and you have to kind of be perceived as a good guy, it's quite similar in the way that they're trying to protect their image whilst trying to commit these terrible acts. And I thought that was where the show kind of had some positives and did some things well.
So Gorm is not being invaded, right? They are a member state of the Empire. They have representation in the Senate. This is not analogous to country A invading country B for its resources, right? This is analogous to the central government wants to do something in one state, region, province, whatever the case may be, and they are basically forcing their will on the locals, right? That's the analogy. So first of all, I think a global war on terror metaphor is 20 years too late. This is not especially current or topical. Like today we have other stuff going on, and there's a certain time lag built into making a show like this. But even like 2 years ago, there was other stuff going on that you could have used as a basis for a story about this. The way the Empire operates does not connect to the way I understand like fascists actually operating. We don't really see like Gorman Gorman industrialists being bought, or you could cast a wide net in terms of what parallels you could make. These things operate kind of by creating like a web of loyalties, like rewarding loyalty and creating dependencies and punishing dissent, often very brutally and stuff like this, right? So I don't know. I did not feel like, oh yeah, this is how it goes. I don't know. I just was not impressed.
But question, because like surveillance and resistance are big factors of fascism, right? So could you say that they did kind of like show fascism, however it didn't they didn't fulfill as much, they didn't tick as much boxes when it comes to the criterias of showing fascism to your standard? Because I think when it comes to what they shown was the basic level, because I'm not too familiar with, I'm similar to her, I'm not a historian when it comes to stuff like this. And obviously, you said you're not a historian, however, it's a hobby, right? But you clearly know way more than us. In terms of like as I mentioned, surveillance and resistance, they are big factors when it comes to fascism. But I'm guessing we could say that that's like surface level. There's way more layers to it. So could you say that they showed the surface level, however, they just didn't show everything else? As playing these advocate.
Sorry, before you answer that as well, is your issue more with the show or the people? Because I know you mentioned at the start it was like people were sort of praising it for it. I don't know whether any of this, not cast, but like producers or writers came out and sort of kind of like talked about it or mentioned it. But I don't know. It feels like you're giving the show a little bit of a hard time for it. But I don't know whether it was their sort of complete true intention to sort of completely sort of portray sort of fascism in this universe. Because again, I know people are praising it for it, but it could not be the show's fault, and it could just be like the way that people took away from it.
I think it's definitely how the show wants to be portrayed and wants to be perceived, and that's in the marketing and in the presentation, and it's also in the discourse, right? If this was simply, a plucky band of rebels fighting against stormtroopers, then I think I would have much lower standards. But because this is presented as the smart one, the gritty one, the realistic one, I reserve the right to ask the question, really, is it? And when I do, not much comes up, is my problem, right? So just as one example, right? So if I was writing a story about fascism, like one of the principles that fascism operates by is that the rules only apply to you. They don't apply to them. And the rules are constructed in such a way that you have to break them. And so when they want to get rid of you, they can hang you with the rules you've broken, but everybody has to break the rules. So, for example, corruption is illegal in fascism, but it's expected. You have to bribe people, otherwise you will not get what you need. Never mind what you want, what you need. And then if somebody wants to get rid of you, they can charge you with bribery and corruption. Like that's an example of how that works, right? So throughout, we're constantly seeing kind of like a reference to kind of the rules and to laws and all of this. But those are supposed to be a farce in fascism. That is something that should have kind of been, I think, more front and center, because that's a really important thing to get. That the laws are tools for a fascist regime, but they are not actually the rules by which society functions. And because they are such a farce, you have to break them, and breaking them makes you vulnerable. And I'm not saying this show had to do this, right? It's just one aspect. There are many others. I'm just saying you could have woven that into the story, where characters have to do stuff like this, where they want to play by the rules, but they can't. And then when they don't, they get punished for it the minute they become... and there's a little bit like this, like when Deirdre gets thrown into prison, it's because she's inconvenient, right? And because she's in the way of somebody else who wants to advance their career. And that is kind of the kind of thing I was talking about, right? Where characters kind of find out that the rules are not real, and they are simply a farce and kind of a facade. So that's just one example, right? And there can be many different things.
No, I don't completely disagree on sort of the fashion side of things. Again, I feel like you're a little more clued up on it. I don't feel like I had an issue with how the Imperial was portrayed. I don't think we were kind of looking for the same things, and I feel like that's probably where a lot of the differences come from. Because for me, I got what I wanted. I got the character that thought he was on the right side of things, but wasn't. I got the inner workings of how they were kind of like scheming and planning and trying to manipulate and stuff like that. I had like, the one that, again, like you mentioned, like the one that's like trying to overachieve, but in doing so has kind of, messed things up. And then that same ruthlessness that they've been applying to everyone else is now sort of being applied to them when they kind of thought that they were maybe above it. And even just like the kind of like internal meetings that they were having, even just like questions like, I can't remember what it was, but the answer to it was, we're just arresting too many people, and we're not able to kind of like work effectively because we're just like imprisoning too many people. And it was just like, just kind of like things like that where we're just seeing the inner workings of it, and we're seeing how different people sort of maneuver within the Imperial. I don't know. I feel like I got enough from it, but again, I understand kind of like you're wanting a little bit more in terms of how the show sort of portrayed itself and how it could have tied a little bit more into sort of fascism and them evidencing it a little bit. And part of it might be that by the time we get to Gorm, they're already plotting against the Imperial, and it seems like they've been doing this for a while, because when they talk about sort of Cyril, I feel like, if I remember correctly, that they say something about how he's like a little bit different to the ones that they had before, to sort of the other sort of people that had been put in this position before, and he was one that they could get into, and they had to sort of like kind of take the risk and move a little bit fast to try and try to kind of like manipulate him. So yeah, maybe it started a bit too into the story and we didn't see too much of like what happened before, but I don't know. It worked for me. Yeah. Is all I say.
But I mean, like I've seen like stories set in like France in 1942, and there are German officers who are part of the occupying force, and they kind of make connections with the locals, and then they kind of stumble into the resistance, and they start to see things from the point of view of the people they're occupying and stuff like this, right? I've seen stories like this before, and it feels like the people who wrote this didn't. And I think that is my really big, like, rip off some good movies is my ask, basically. Yeah. But honestly, like, Star Wars has always been kind of like a blending of influences of stuff the writers liked, right? Like, original Star Wars was like sci-fi serials and westerns and World War II movies. Mandalorian was like spaghetti westerns, right? So why are you not ripping off like World War II movies? Not about the big battles, but about the resistance fighters. Could have been something. But yeah, I think we've beaten this particular topic. Let's talk about whether it's proper Star Wars or not.
I feel like you're probably the expert on it, because again, I feel like we've all watched Star Wars. I think me and Jonathan more casually. I think you're more invested than we are. So yeah, go on.
So there are a lot of opinions out there about how it's not real Star Wars unless it's space battles and lightsabers, and how it's basically like, if it's not about the Jedi, it's not real Star Wars, right? And so when Andor, like the first season, was announced, I was really happy that we were getting a show that is not about a Jedi, right? And we've had The Mandalorian, we've had Rogue One, right? But for the most part, the Jedi are front and center, and I always found them to be the least interesting part of the Star Wars universe. And so having something just focused on the ground level of the rebellion has always been my thing. I do think there are a few criticisms of Andor, like the fact that there are no aliens with speaking parts beyond one line is a bit of an issue. That should have just been there. And they walk a fine line. In some cases, I think it looks like a proper 70s retro sci-fi thing, and lots of little detail, like a lot of the technology really works out. And then occasionally we get like shots of Coruscant and stuff like this. But I do think there are a few key ways in which this does not quite line up with Star Wars in the way it should. This has nothing to do with lightsabers. It doesn't have anything to do with space battles. So one of these is that one of the key things of characterization of Star Wars historically has been that the core is human-dominated, and the further out, the more diverse and varied things get, right? More aliens, a bigger range of civilizations and places and stuff like this. And here, it's all very mundane, right? Like every planet, like literally the Gormans are just French people. Right? Is that not a little bit, like, can you try a bit harder? And like the first few episodes are just set on a wheat planet. Like they couldn't even put a second moon in the sky, right? You know what I mean? Like maybe there is a second moon, I don't know. But there would have been easy ways to make it a little bit more fantastical. Everything that's not in Coruscant could very well be just on Earth. And that is a little bit underwhelming. In addition to that, in episode 4, and this is like a year before episode 4, right? We get a couple of clues about what the galaxy is like. In A New Hope, this is very brief and it's just alluded to, and we don't see very much of it. But we get a pretty clear picture of what the Empire is like. I don't think what we see in Andor is really borne out by that. So one example of this is, in A New Hope, we are told that the Republic turned into the Empire, but so far the Empire has been afraid of overreaching. And so they have kept the appearances of democracy, right? There's still a Senate, there's still votes, there's still senators. Over time, the Emperor has kind of been extending his power, but he could not really make it very overt without the Death Star, right? And the Death Star is the game changer. That's the whole plot of Episode 4, right? Like outside of Luke's story specifically, but in terms of why the Death Star is a big deal, that is why. And I don't think we're seeing this here. We spent a lot of time with senators and in the inner workings of the government, and I did not get this impression. I'm not entirely sure what form it should have taken, but I did not kind of get this impression that like we are still pretending to be the Republic, but when the chips are down, we know who's really in charge, that kind of thing.
Do you kind of feel like in the scene prior to the Mon Mothma speech, when you have the different senators and they're kind of echoing the narrative of the Empire or the Imperial in this, in terms of sort of kind of like what happened to Gorm, and you have like those like puppets in place, you have like those pieces in place that are just like kind of like mouthpieces for the Senate in terms of creating the narrative. So it kind of like ties back to what I was saying about, trying to keep a positive image whilst sort of kind of like doing what they needed to do on Gorm. And that kind of like ties back to the news report as well, because you kind of see the switch of the news reporters, how it's being broadcast initially, and then the change when they have like the second report, the second reports come in. And I feel like that's them trying to maintain the democracy and trying to maintain an image of sort of democracy, and them not having this overarching power. And of course, we visit, the Wheat Planet, we visit a few different planets. You can kind of feel a little bit more of the weight of the Imperial, and you can feel a little bit more the oppression of that. But I do feel like there was small elements in there, if you kind of remember those pieces in those episodes.
I think you can make it work, but I was kind of missing like a recognition of this is what Episode 4 told us the Empire is like on a political level, and now we are seeing that for the first time. I did not see any kind of attempt to actually do this, right? Like, and this could have been in how the senators behave, how they plan, what they think they can get away with and what they can't, and certainly they are cautious, right? There's certainly an element of they can still give speeches and they can still vote, but they have to be careful, right? But if you put those two next to each other, I don't think they quite line up, is my thing.
I'll trust you on that, because I feel like you've got better knowledge or better memory of Episode 4. But I was going to say as well, I do agree with your first point about how they could have made it a little bit more fantastical, in the sense of, again, I don't believe that Star Wars is all Jedi, and I don't believe Star Wars is all space battles. And I feel like one of the great things about Star Wars is that it establishes this really vast universe. This really vast universe of different planets with different different people, different species, different animals, this, that, and the other. And I feel like that's one of the kind of selling points of Star Wars. I mean, especially with sort of the marketing they do in sort of some of the cute animals that they try to market to kids and people as well. But I do agree that was for sure lacking in this, and it could definitely have been sprinkled in a little bit more. So I do agree with that, and as a fair criticism of it not being completely Star Wars.
And like we see more aliens on Coruscant than we see on Gorm, for example. And that's the wrong way around. Like every time we get closer to the core, there should be more humans, should be more uniform, it should be more harmonized. And the further out we go, the more chaotic and the more varied it should get. I think that is just one of the things that to me makes it feel not as Star Warsy as it should. And then another example I have of this is in Episode 4, when Leia gets captured by the Imperials, she openly defies Vader, right? Because she says this is a diplomatic mission and this is official Senate business and you have no right to detain us and stuff like this, right? So there's like this sense that there's a legal fiction of what the place should be and what it actually is. Again, I did not see this reflected. Like, people should kind of believe that they still live in the Republic in some way. Right? As far as they are concerned, this is the Republic, and they've been under martial law for 20 years because of the Galactic Civil War, right? But they should believe that things will go back to normal at some point, but it's been 20 years and it hasn't, right? And it's another thing that's, I think, kind of missing. Another thing that's entirely missing is the Separatists. Palpatine did not come into power because of terrorism. He came into power because of the Separatists, and because a civil war was tearing the galaxy apart, and people were looking for anybody to make it stop. And Palpatine made it stop, and it's because he controlled both sides, which the public obviously didn't know. But that is his legitimacy. That is why he is in power. For example, one thing they could have done in this is to say Guam is trying to secede, and Guam could spark another civil war. And remember how your planet would have been wiped out if it hadn't been for Palpatine's wisdom and leadership, right? Stuff like this, right? Like, it should not have been terrorism, I think. It should have been the threat of another separatist movement.
You mentioned the Galactic Civil War, and I was like, I have no clue about that, to be fair. So
that's the prequels.
Oh, I don't. I only watched Revenge of the Sith. So when I was being introduced to Star Wars, I was specifically told, skip episode 1 and skip episode 2. They're both, completely garbage. Watch episode 3. And I only ever watched that once, and then kind of go into A New Hope, etc. So
yeah,
all of that completely over my head.
And that is good advice in general, but it's more like the reason Palpatine got into power and turned the Republic into the Empire is because he had engineered the Civil War, where half the galaxy had seceded. That is why he is in power, and that is why he has all this authority and all this political capital. And that should be part of the like the narrative. Stapling a war on terror narrative on this or metaphor on this, I don't think makes it stronger. And I think that none of these things are deal breakers. None of these things ruin the story. But I think all of them put together kind of make it not feel quite right, especially considering how close we are. Like, this leads directly into Rogue One, and Rogue One leads directly into A New Hope, right? So there is Darth Vader running around, hunting rebels in this, right? And I'm not saying he should have appeared, right? Like, that's maybe a bit overdone, and he appears in Rogue One and all of that. I'm just saying we are very close to the original trilogy here. This is not 10 years out. This is not 5 years out. This is less than a year out. And it does not feel like the same world for these reasons. It has nothing to do with Jedi or lightsabers or anything like that. It's just what we know about the Empire and what the Republic used to be like, and from Episode 4, and what we know about what the founding of the Empire was from the prequels. Those two things don't quite line up. Like, Andor is the connecting piece, right? And it does not connect the pieces, in my opinion. Okay. You're welcome to fight me on this, by the way, but it's I think that is a big part of why it was not compelling.
Hard to say, because I don't have the same knowledge of the prequels and the same memory on episode 1. For me, why it did feel Star Wars, and it did feel like it was what I said before about how Star Wars was built to be sort of this kind of vast universe, etc. But for me, it was like the connective tissue that it did have, in terms of, one, for me, it enriched my viewing experience of Rogue One, in terms of applying a good backstory and applying good knowledge into one of my favorite Star Wars movies of the series, to the relation to the Death Star and what came before the plans being found and stuff like that, was tied it in. And then you had some familiar characters in there as well, like Ben Mendelsohn's character that popped up in this as well, and it was just okay, just kind of seeing the chain of command and seeing how there's the different levels and hierarchy to it. So probably not for the best reasons. It felt like Star Wars to me, and probably not for what most people would look for. But for me, I kind of had what I needed in there to make it feel in the universe. And again, I'm not one of those people that it needs to have this, or it needs to connect to this, or I need to see lightsabers, this, that, any other. For me personally, I feel like there's so many people, so many different races, so many different communities, planets, etc. that's introduced to it. Is just tell me an interesting story within that universe, and I'm all in, because I'm semi-invested in the Star Wars universe. Not something that's cleared up as everyone else, but the same for all of my favorite kind of sci-fi fantasy universes, whether it's Harry Potter and stuff like that as well. It's okay, we have the Harry Potter series. Tell me something interesting about a different period, because you've got such a rich world, you've got such rich lore behind everything. It's just find something random in 50 years, 100 years, or in the past, that just makes sense and makes it a little bit better. So yeah, I don't feel like I scrutinize it as deeply, and I don't feel like I look for as much, not member berries, but things that kind of remind me of the universe. It's what I'd say.
If this was not literally said 5 minutes before the Battle of Yavin, I would cut it a little bit more slack.
Yeah, which is fair.
And my standards are not impossible, right? Like, just bringing this back to kind of the whole treatment of authoritarianism. If you like the idea of this, watch Babylon 5. One of the best political science fiction shows ever put on screen. Like, this does basically a lot of what Andor wants to do, but a lot better, I'm sorry to say. It's basically about the story about how Earth becomes a fascist dictatorship and allies with the alien bad guys. And the story is about a couple of officers who kind of rebel and basically go rogue and kind of try to fix their nation, but they at least initially can't because they're just like one space station. And like their entire society has gone fascist. And it's been accused of being polemics against two US presidents since it was made in the 30 years since it was made. But it was made before that because it understands these ideas so well that every time somebody even slightly goes into that direction, you see the parallels and you kind of see the tropes and you can see the elements recur. Because the person who wrote this studied how this stuff actually works and then told a story about a society that becomes that. And what happens when good people do nothing and then the good people try to fix it. So anyway, just watching this kind of made me want to watch Babylon 5 again, and I think I will this weekend. So that's my recommendation for the week.
Overall, I say I had a good time with it. I do acknowledge that, it's not as good as season 1, but I don't necessarily have an issue with it. Like I said, I do feel like I had issues with the pacing of certain episodes. It felt slower than it had to be. And it did feel like it was more character focused rather than an engaging story like they did in season 1. I think just like kind of like the progression in season 2 wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But yeah, overall, I still had a good time. And I'm looking forward to watching Rogue One to just see how everything kind of like connects. But yeah, I'd give Andor season 2 a 7 out of 10. Andor season 1 though, that was 8 out of 10.
Rogue One has the best Darth Vader action sequence in all of Star Wars. Hands down. It's like brilliant. That literally appears and completely steals the show. But last one to me, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I loved it. I loved sort of the kind of where they took the story. I loved the whole situation that was going on Gorm and the different pieces that they were sort of putting together on there. Really enjoyed the characters and how they were developed and how they were moved, how they were kind of built up and enriched a little bit more. I mean, especially I know we did talk. We kind of briefly spoke about like episode 10, but just that whole Luthor and I'm going to forget his daughter's name, but just like that, the sort of going back and forth between the past and her having to complete this mission of breaking into the hospital and basically having to kill him so that he doesn't talk and doesn't say what he knows. I feel like that was really well done. That had like a lot of like really good emotions in that and good tense action and stuff like that. I thought that was like brilliant. And yeah, I had a great time. Made me go straight into Rogue One after watching it, which is job well done for Disney and the creators. Bringing more eyeballs to some of their past work. And yeah, I don't know, man. I just thought it was all great. I loved it. I loved it. Is what I'd say.
Yeah, so I think I've been in this conversation been more negative because I think those negatives are more interesting than the positives. I have huge issues with just the general storytelling style, the pacing. I found the pieces a bit disjointed. I did not feel like it had nearly enough to say compared to its reputation or its ambition. And so for that reason, I really, outside of a couple of sequences, I really had to force myself through it. And I did not expect this. I was looking forward to this for 2 years. I wish I could get more enjoyment out of it. But I just can't, just because of how the story is structured and what it's about and how it's told. So that's a 5 out of 8. Not terrible, not great.
I forgot to give my rating. I would give this 8.5 out of 10.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for tuning into today's debate.
If you reach this part of the episode, thank you very much for working with us. We appreciate your time. Of course, if you liked everything that you heard in this episode and you enjoyed the discussion/debate, tell a friend. And of course, if you hated everything and you thought we were chatting a bunch of nonsense, tell an enemy. We are the Eye of the Storm podcast.
All right, guys, you heard it here first. We're going to catch you next week. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.